Have you heard the saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend? Well, during the American Revolution, one enemy of France was Britain. And as the saying goes, France and the fledgling United States joined forces as friends to defeat the British. But from the viewpoint of the French monarchy, there was a dark side to this newfound friendship that opened up the French people to some new and dangerous ideas. Today we welcome Dr. Bertrand von Rumbeck, please forgive the pronunciation, to talk about the American Revolution's influence in France. This is Too Complicated for History.
Welcome, everybody. And I'd like to welcome our guest, author and professor of American history in Paris and coordinator of America 2026, which is a conference exploring the American Revolution, but taking place in Europe over the next couple of years, Bertrand van Rumbeck. Thanks so much for being here, Bertrand.
Thank you.
So before we get into the actual deep history stuff and start getting into the nitty gritty of what we're here to talk about, I would bet that there's a good chunk of our listeners that didn't realize that there were historians that study America and American history in Europe. Are there a lot of you, or are you one of the few?
Depending on the period. But in France, we have a thriving community of scholars, U.S. scholars, but most of them working on the contemporary United States, on cinema, for example, or material culture, on race also, politics. But there is also a small part of us who work on the 18th century. There are the very few of us in France and also in Europe, actually. But France has a strong program. We call it civilization instead of history, even though I do history and many of my colleagues do history, but we use civilization to include people who do contemporary things, contemporary topics. But I would say we have an association of Americanists, and there are at least 1,000 members, so it's strong.
Oh, wow. That's more than I thought.
Wow, yeah. So you must have a lot of interest with students.
Definitely. Many students want to know about, because they watch so many U.S. programs on TV that they want to know more about this very strange, faraway country that is influencing our lifestyle. So, and this will bring us to their topic, of course, because we still write about America like they used to in the 1780s.
I was going to say that's a beautiful transition to what we're here to talk about, and it's a little bit just to give the audience an overview. What we wanted to talk to Bertrand about was kind of like the French conception or the ideas of America that took place around the time of the American Revolution, the 1770s, 1780s. Because as we don't like to give a lot of weight to it in our history courses, especially in elementary school. But the French were very involved in the Revolution, and it's an interesting and fascinating story how this monarchy got involved in a war across the Atlantic, and against one of their main rivals in the world. Bertrand, do you think you could set the stage a little bit for what people thought of, I guess, the early American uprisings, like the rebellions, things like that, or what context do we need to know in order to understand the French perspective at that time?
Well, at first there were very few publications on America, that is British America, let's say in the 1750s or before, because to the French people, the Americas were mainly the Caribbean, Saint-Domingue, which became Haiti after the Haitian Revolution in 1804, Guadeloupe, Martinique, islands that are still part of France today, and of course New France, Acadia, that became Nova Scotia in 1713, and New France that was lost at the end of the 7 Years' War. So there were very few books, and the books that were published in France were on French America or Spanish America, because to people then, the Americas were mostly the Iberian colonies, Brazil and New Spain and Peru. That's what when people talk about America, that was it. Then in the 1750s, the war between France and Great Britain in North America led French people publish essays on the British colonies, these unknown British colonies that suddenly defeated France, with Great Britain, obviously, and took over Canada. Mm-hmm. So that was the first, that's how it started in the 1750s. Then in the 1760s, Dickinsons letters were translated into French. Actually, they were published in 68 and translated right away in 69 by a merchant named Jacques Barbeux Dubourg, who was Franklin's best friend, actually. He also translated Franklin's works into French. And he translated Dickinsons Letters. That's how it started in the late 60s. And then gradually in the, let's say, mid-70s, the French government, Versailles, let's say, published a periodical named, sorry, it will be in French, Les Affaires de l'Angleterre et de l'Amérique. And this was about the revolution. And it started in 1734. And that's when this brought literally the American crisis and then the Anglo-American crisis and then the American Revolution into France. And I would say 1774.
A Dickinson crossover is not what I was expecting, to be honest.
And are you talking about the letters from a Pennsylvania farmer? Are those the Dickinsons letters? Okay. And can you give a little overview of what exactly he was writing about that were translated and then perhaps garnered interest in France when they were able to read them?
Well, what is interesting is that a philosopher like Diderot, a major French philosopher of the Enlightenment, read those letters 10 years later, almost 10 years later, in the mid-1770s. And he wrote something fascinating. He said, how does the monarchy let publish essays or letters like this, and without anticipating that it will change us? And that's, to me, it's the complexity of French assistance to the American Revolution, is that the monarchy was so much interested in fighting Britain and actually weakening Britain, because Great Britain had become too powerful in the eyes of the French after the 7 Years' War, because the French wanted to weaken Great Britain in order to reach an older balance of power, a traditional balance of power in Europe. That was to the advantage of France, of course, but they didn't want France to dominate Europe, but they certainly didn't want Britain to dominate Europe. And so to the complexity of this French assistance, this monarchy helping republicans, can only be understood when people realize that Louis XVI, the French monarchy, always, the French monarchy had a tradition to help rebels wherever in Europe, as long as they could weaken a potential enemy. So it's not that they were so much interested in Republicans or Americans, at least, Louis XVI and his foreign affairs secretary, let's say his name was Vergennes. They just wanted, they thought, okay, that's a way to weaken Great Britain. But the thing is, to go back to Diderot's quote, is that the French monarchy helped republicans without anticipating that French people reading essays by republicans might influence them against the monarchy.
Right. They didn't realize they were actually training their citizens to do similar to what the American colonists were doing.
Yeah, and to clarify for our audience, just to clarify for our audience, when Bertrand says Republicans, he's talking small R Republicans, not big R Republicans like we have in the American political system. Just so, because we'll use that word a lot.
Parties,
we're talking about a kind of a political person.
Well, Republicans versus monarchists. I guess people in favor of a republic.
Yeah, and there's a bunch of different things that were talked about, like the parliamentarians, the Republican, like the way they're advocating for particular structures of government. Not a political party, but yeah. Oh, sorry, Lynn, I didn't mean to interrupt. But
No, that's exactly what I was about to say. That we weren't talking about the political parties, but the Republican was being used in a different form here.
But to go back to your original question, what French people, or at the beginning, let's say philosophers, were interested in what Dickinson wrote, was the way contested taxation. That was very interesting to French people. How the Americans wanted to negotiate their own taxation, and the idea of no taxation without representation of what developed out of this pamphlet war between Britain and America was very interesting to French people, who let's share with our audience that the French people didn't have an assembly as opposed to Great Britain. So it was an absolute monarchy. And the interesting thing about the crisis, the Anglo-American crisis, and the U.S., or at least British America, entering the scene, is that traditionally the French envied the British. I guess they fought them, but at the same time they envied their constitutional monarchy. So suddenly, with the birth of the U.S. Republic in 1783, there was another model that was still English-speaking territory, but still that was not England. So it's a very complex issue, and this has to be factored in.
That's very interesting. That I never really thought about the cross-pollination, because you hear a lot about how the Enlightenment thinkers influenced early American thinking,
right?
Like the folks over here. You never really hear how folks they were reading writings from America and how it was influencing stuff going the other way across the Atlantic. That's really interesting.
Right, and how we always talk about how France wanted to help us, but it's more they wanted to. It was more about pushing back against England than it was about just helping this new nation. It's sort of the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing.
Well, you had both. That is, you had Louis XVI and his government. Really, wanted, of course, to weaken Britain, to reestablish a balance that had been lost, clearly. Okay. But at the same time, you had members of the French nobility who wanted to fight. They wanted a war, because to the French nobility, the essence of life was war. And so the War of Independence was an opportunity. Somebody like Lafayette, of course, he wrote about freedom, which can be understood in different meanings, actually. But anyway, and he wanted to glory. I mean, the nobility, the French nobility was looking for glory through arms, through fighting. Because as opposed to the English nobility, the French nobility did not work and did not really invest much. They still had a very archaic perception of their role in society through war, hunting and war, basically. And then you had people who were really interested in the American cause, maybe at a lower level, who there was an opportunity to fight Britain, but also they were curious about this, not knowing that it would become a republic, obviously, at the beginning, but they were interested in this faraway land and this faraway rebellion.
So sorry for the interruption, but we're going to take a brief break now for a word from our sponsors.
That interest, did it cross over into criticism of the monarchy? That, like you're saying, that there was interest in they admired the assembly system in Britain, and here's this other model. Did these folks know, at least the philosophers or people in general, know that there was something wrong with the way things were, like the status quo in France, or was there dissatisfaction generally that early? Because I don't know why I always think of it as having started with the revolution going forward, like, oh, that was inspirational and caused more stuff. But I guess some of those feelings predate the actual the revolution itself.
Well, it's a very complex period. It's the 70s and 80s in France before 1789, because it can be argued in different ways. You can say that philosophers like Diderot and Rousseau and others wanted to change society. At the same time, other people wanted to keep the monarchy. Um, Other people wanted to have some sort of assembly, but other people wanted to keep the assemblies, because what makes France very complex at the time is that there were at least 16 assemblies. There were regional assemblies, but they did not vote laws. They registered royal edicts, but they still had power, regional power, what was called at the time privileges, because once over the history of France and the French monarchy, each region that entered the kingdom negotiated to keep some of their privileges. For example, it could be a tax on salt, or it could be the right to keep a parlement. It was called a parlement. There was one in Brittany, there was one in Dauphiny, and there was one in Paris, obviously. So, and you had regions or provinces without parliament. So there was very complex puzzle. So especially after the American War, what we call here the American War, in French we say la guerre d'Amérique, that is the war where we send soldiers to, cost so much because wars are so expensive, that it accelerated reforms. So you can say, well, the revolution started in May 1789 with the Estates General meeting. But also you can say, no, it started a few years before, when the monarchy tried to reform the system, especially its finances, but failed. So you had deeper roots. What it's obvious is that the American Revolution and France's involvement accelerated the process.
And I think the same way as you just explained, we tend, historians of the era, we tend to separate the Revolutionary War, which was the actual war, with the American Revolution, which started about 1765 with the Stamp Act. And so I think that's kind of what Isaac was getting at, is you had a long time, 65 to 75. So you've got a decade of all of this growing, which we consider part of the revolution, but not the war itself.
Yes, and the French people read what was translated, in the periodical that I mentioned.
Right.
That was Les Affaires de l'Angleterre et de l'Amérique, that was published and financed by Versailles, actually, because Versailles was in a very difficult position. The government and the monarchy, they had to convince the people, although it's an absolute monarchy, you need to still convince your subjects that it's good for the country. I mean, you sometimes we sort of fantasize on the absolute monarchies being dictatorships, but it's not true. There was always negotiations with the provinces, with the parlement in the case of France, but with the subjects also, and with the elites. Anyway, so the Versailles was caught into something very difficult to manage, is that they had to convince the French people that the war was good for them, for France. But at the same time, there was this risk that if the United States became a republic, and whatever was being translated could influence France. I mean, it's obvious. I mean, somebody like Louis XVI or Vergennes and other ministers could not have been so naive as not to think that it would have some sort of influence. But they had to translate whatever Americans wrote against Parliament or against George III in order to convince French people. I mean, they had to make it known. We cannot imagine France sending its military to America without the people knowing about it. This could not be done.
That's a tough situation to be in, thinking about convincing them that the American war and them sending their soldiers over to fight in it is a good thing, but let's not copy it here because we're just fine how we are. Here being France, yeah.
No, but this is the core of it, I think. Is that what we might describe as being naive was a very deep feeling that America was different.
Mm-hmm.
So if these colonies became a republic, it could not happen to France because France
Right.
was an older society, an ancien régime society, whose structure was rooted into the Middle Ages. So it has nothing to do with those colonies founded, only 150 years before.
Right.
For French people, it meant they had no history. So France was different. Therefore, what was happening in America could not happen to France. I mean, this is probably something that was felt very strongly, and that sort of balanced the risk of it happening to France.
Yeah, and to be fair, they were kind of right. It wasn't exactly the same.
No.
It didn't turn out exactly the same. But that's so fascinating how America kind of captured a lot of consciousness, and because it seems like it was purposeful. Like, hey, we need to garner interest in this,
Right.
From like the top down, because we want to do X. But then that there was, it coincided with this, intellectual interest. You sent us over some stuff over about writing contests.
Yes.
that were held. I would love to hear a little bit about those.
Yeah, this is a very, very French thing, even today, because today in France we love contests. And to become a civil servant, I'm going to joke about it, being myself a civil servant, being a professor, college professor, but maybe half the population dream of working for the state, And to do that, you need to take an exam, a very highly competitive nationwide exam. Anyway, so if you go back to the 18th century, you had those prize-winning contests that were organized by academy. There were 32 academy, and academy were like learned societies. There was one in Paris, that was very famous, called Académie Française, and it's still around. There was also the Académie des Sciences, that invited Franklin, for example. But main regional cities like Lyon, Toulouse, La Rochelle, had Marseille had academy themselves, regional academies that were very prestigious, because most of them were founded in the early 18th century, and by royal patents. So they are the royal authorization to get together and organize contests. So these contests, in the early 18th century, there may have been 50 of them from 1700 to 1710. In the 1780s, there were 600 of them.
Jeez.
And over the 18th century, there were probably around 2,000 contests. So I was really, in my writing, I talk about a contest frenzy. And they could be on anything. Let me give you an example of topics, because topics could be a question, or could be a statement. I had to comment on a statement. For example, the severity of laws. Okay, that's it. You had to write, pages about that. Or my favorite, how to clean the streets of Paris. Wonderful question. Or you had the role of the historian. That's also one of my favorite questions. And you had many questions on medicine, agriculture, manufacture, local history also. For example, how was Marseille under the Greeks, for example? And you had to write about, because it was about erudition and eloquence. You had to write well. And so there were, hundreds of questions, and contests were organized pretty much the same way. That is, they were open to everybody, which is very unusual for French society at the time. And so anybody could participate. You would just submit a memoir to the academy. You heard about the contest through the press, and you send a memoir, and at the same time you placed an envelope with your name and address and a motto, usually in Latin. And this motto was also on your memoir, because the memoir was unsigned, because it had to be anonymous.
Oh.
And then at the end of the contest, whoever won, the members of the academy would open the envelope, match the mottos, and see who wrote what. And so that's how it worked.
That sounds
anonymous. Cool.
It like that. That is such an intellectual. Like, I'm just laughing at the comparison. Like, what kind of contests do we hold nationally here? It's like hot dog eating.
Right? Yeah, a lot of eating. Yes.
Like, there's a lot of eating competitions. I was like, competitions for like who can keep their hand on a car for the longest gets the car. Like, those are like American contests. This is so, for lack of a better phrase, like highfalutin.
And what was the
shocking.
What were the prizes? Was it just bragging rights? Did you win money? What was, what did you win?
Yeah, well, you won money, yes. Usually in the form of a medal.
Oh.
That you could then sell because it was worth a certain amount of money, or there was also a cash prize. But you also won reputation in the Republic of Letters, what was called the Republic of Letters. And they were very interesting. Major philosophers competed, but usually they did not compete, but they answered the questions. They felt probably they were above competing with a local, cleric or doctor. But they still answer the question and that's why those contests are also important, because they launched debates, nationwide or European-wide debates, and people could just publish an answer without submitting for the contest. And you also had local champions, totally forgotten today. Local champions who, for example, at the Academy of Toulouse in southwestern France, there was one writer who was a lawyer, actually, local lawyer, who won a series of contests offered by the Academy of Toulouse. He only competed in Toulouse, and he won one contest on the American Revolution, by the way. And so and he became a member of the Academy because that was also an avenue for promotion. If you won contest, you would be noticed, because I forgot to say, but the winner had his essay published at the cost of the Academy. So suddenly it was available nationwide.
Was this so? Actually, this is a good question that our producer Pat actually is feeling right now. You said it was open to anyone? Did that include women?
Yes, there were a few women send memoirs, definitely.
Did any win that you know of?
Not that I know of.
Gosh.
But it's a small percentage.
Right. Just the fact that they accepted them, I'm impressed by.
That's so interesting. So, so some of these were done on the American Republic. Some of these questions. What were those? What kind of questions were they asking about the America in this contest?
So, two type of questions. There was one at the Academy of Toulouse in 1784. So after U.S. independence, that was labeled the greatness and importance of the American Revolution. That's it. So you had to comment on that. And to me, it's very revealing, and it's very French in the sense that even today, when you take an exam, you better pay attention to the wording of the topic, because the wording of the topic implies an answer. Because if the wording is greatness and importance of revolution, you're not going to downplay the American Revolution unless you don't want to win.
Right.
Okay?
Sure.
So, the other type of questions, we had three of them in Pau, which is near the Pyrenees, near Spain, a small town in the mountains. In Lyon was offered the same questions, and also in Paris. And this question was the consequences of the colonization of the New World, or rather, the consequences of the discovery of the New World. And that was what was asked of the contestants was to think about colonization. And this obviously was brought about by the birth of the United States, because the first question was in Pau was in 1774, then in Lyon in the 1780s, because in Lyon they decided, it was in 1781, no winner, the members of the Academy decided not to award the prize. So it was renewed in 83, then again renewed in 85, then again renewed in 89. So it's a
Wow.
wonderful window for us, because throughout the 1780s, people answered this question, that is the consequences of the discovery of America. And actually, I'd like to read the question to you, because it's a very complex question. I think it's fascinating, and if you think that it lasted for an entire decade. So here it is. Has the discovery of America been useful or harmful to humankind? If goods resulted from it, what are the means to preserve them and increase them? If it caused ills, how can they be remedied? So it's a wonderful question, and it's extremely complex, because you have to think of colonization since Christopher Columbus, basically.
Mhm.
And then to think of everything that happened since, but good or bad. And for the bad, you have to think of remedies. For the good, you have to think of how to keep them. So it's humankind. It's not Europe, because the same question was asked in Paris in 1792, but it was reduced to Europe. That is, what were the consequences of the discovery of America to Europe? And that changes everything, because if you say humankind, you mention the Native Americans, and you have to mention, of course, slavery.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if it is just Europe, you can limit your conversation to intellectual consequences.
So sorry for the interruption, but we're going to take a brief break now for a word from our sponsors.
Is there a particular reason that you think that it went from being European focused to suddenly becoming a global issue, that they decided to expand it to this extent?
Well, when the Lyon question was probably thought to be too difficult, and since the Academy of Lyon awarded no prize, the Académie Française, based in Paris, probably say we better make it simpler, because nobody can answer that question.
Right.
That's probably the reason. And also, probably in 1792, of course, what is fascinating is that you had this essay contest over 10, 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
So you were thinking about history as events were taking place, because
Right.
what makes it very interesting for Lyon is that when they started in 1781, that was before Yorktown. In 1789, you have a nation. So, of course, the answers are going to be different.
Right.
Whether you answer the question in 1781 or 1789.
Right.
And it shows in the essays, if you look at them over the years, you realize that, because what is, I think, totally unexpected, if we don't know the 18th century, if we don't know that period, what is totally unexpected is that colonization is condemned. That is,
Wow.
people in the 18th century, at least those who answered those questions, thought that colonization was devastating. The destruction of the native what was called civilizations at the time, slavery, of course, all the major evil, of the time, wars, colonial wars, immigration that was thought to weaken Europe. All those things, made colonization, especially Spanish colonization, because mixed into it, you also had the anti-Spanish, what is called the Black Legend, anti-Spanish feeling. Look at what Spain did in Mexico or Peru. For example, the mines, the silver and gold mines, where natives were exploited, are always mentioned in the answer. And then suddenly, so 1492, it's a horrible date in human history. But Columbus is saved. It's not his fault. That's what is interesting. Is Columbus is still a hero, but what happened is Europeans made the worst of his discovery. But here comes the United States, the American Revolution, and then the United States. So suddenly Europeans start thinking, hey, look, colonies became a republic. Therefore, there is hope. So it completely changes the answer. In other words, what I say in my writing is that 1776 redeemed 1492.
Oh,
That's such a fascinating level of self-reflection that just isn't is that in the curriculum in France? Like, do people like when you're teaching history at this time to students in France, do you teach that kind of sort of introspection by a nation, like those different perspectives that are happening? Because that's just not the way we teach history here. That like
unfortunately.
yeah, unfortunately, it makes up for such a different dynamic. That like when you think of history, it's either plowed forward by these like gargantuan personalities, or the other extreme is that people are just swept up in sort of what's the word I'm looking for, Lynn? Like the wave, like the historical like trends.
Trends,
The
yeah.
trend. Yeah, the historical trend.
Right.
Like it's those two extremes. But we never think about how the people who were sitting in the trend knew that they were in the trend, or were critical of the people, the great people at the like that. There is much more complex debate and complex thought. Like, so sorry, I'm complaining a little bit about the way we teach history here, but is that part of how you approach historical teachings in France?
Well, definitely. But you are right on target for the 18th century, which allows me to make 2 points here. First, you're totally right. To reflect on colonization and to reflect on the Americas was a way to reflect on Europe. And it's something very important to understand is that it's not that America was neglected, it's that America was seen as a mirror. Say, okay, what did Europeans do in the Americas? Let's look at where we are. That's a way to think of what we are, but what we've done. And the second point is that this reflection on the American Revolution was grafted on a larger reflection on the New World. That is how that's why they always mention discovery. Why this discovery of the New World? What did it bring to humankind? How did it change the world? So it's a very important. And the last thing, and the third comment I want to make is that this is a very interesting windows. By this I mean the 1770s, 1780s. Very interesting windows, unfortunately very short, on anti-colonialism, a sort of anti-colonialism. Of course, it can be nuanced because it's not the anti-colonialism of the 1960s, obviously. It has to be nuanced because this anti-colonialism condemned colonization of land that were inhabited, but was allowed, quote unquote, allowed on land that was not inhabited. And what did inhabited or uninhabited meant to Europeans? It can be discussed, obviously. But it's still a form of anti-colonialism nonetheless. But this is a short window because with the turn of the 19th century, France in Algeria, for example, and England in India will go back to colonialism. So colonialism will be once again justified. So I think this is very interesting to see this 1780s, as a window, and of course related to the American Revolution.
So I'm super curious. I mean, I love the question, but the last part of the question is, if it caused ills, how can they be remedied? Did anybody come up with any ideas about how to remedy slavery or how to remedy, land being taken from Native Americans? What were they saying?
Yeah, but because it's easier to say that the Spaniards did awful things in Spain and in the Americas, but it's something else to find solutions. And actually, that's why I think that's one of the reasons. The other being that the members of the Academy wished for essays that saw the colonization in a good light, I think it was biased in a way. But anyway, one of the reasons, and this can be because you were asking, Isaac, about how we teach and how I use this essay contest in my class, advanced class, and how it can be used is exactly that. Is that the academiciens, the members of the academy, did not award the prize simply because the answers, the memoirs, are incomplete, because they were an attack on colonization, but no remedies, no solutions. Therefore, they cannot get, an A, or A, because
Right.
it's
They would deserve a lot more than that if they came up for a solution for slavery. I mean, it would be.
But in some essays, maybe 2 or 3 essays out of the 50, the people who try to suggest solutions, and they are relatively well known. For example, they wish for natives to intermarry with settlers. That's one way to sort of incorporate
Assimilation,
Native Americans into settler society.
Right.
Also, you need to. There is a very interesting essay where they say where the author says you need to substitute the bow and the arrow for the plow and the oxen. So to make Native Americans farmers. Regarding slavery, of course, to stop the slave trade, and then other possibilities. Other solutions that are suggested are to intermarriage, free, gradual emancipation, because it's known in France that gradual emancipation has been adopted in Pennsylvania in 1780. So it's known that at least the colony, or former British colony, attempted to do that. Which lead me to the Quakers. I think we should talk about the Quakers, by the way.
For sure. We are. We could love to. I would love to talk about. Actually, I would very much love to talk about Quakers.
Absolutely.
But being from Pennsylvania, they're very, very, very fascinating. And we did. It's part of your curriculum, like growing up, because because they're around in the area, so it's part of the local history. But I would love to talk about Quakers.
Just to say that Quakers were in fashion in France at the time, and it's directly related to our topic today, because it's Voltaire in the 1730s. He published what are called English letters, or philosophical letters. They were letters about England. And that was Anglomania. Actually, it started Anglomania of the 18th century. And there were 3 letters devoted to the Quakers. And one of these letters were also devoted to Pennsylvania and William Penn, known in French as Guillaume Penn, Guillaume being William. And then it slowly started sort of fashion about the Quakers that was reinforced by their gradual emancipation, gradual abolition, of course. And so in all those memoirs, the Quakers are the perfect settler, because they made peace with the natives. Quaker slavery is totally forgotten. They are known for their abolitionism. And also, they are good legislators. And Penn is compared to a half-legendary Spartan legislator known as Lycurgus, because at the time, people were, fascinated by the ancient world. So there is this fashion about the Quakers, and all those memoirs, they are spared. They are, and by the way, we haven't mentioned it yet, but it's a very important aspect of this exchange between the United States, what became the United States, and France, are the state constitutions. The state constitutions were translated into French as early as 1776, and they were commented on. And especially the Constitution of Virginia and the Constitution of Pennsylvania, the first Constitution of Pennsylvania. So they were discussed, they were published, translated, published, discussed, and they influenced France's first constitution that was elaborated in 1791. So once again, the Quakers. And the interesting thing is that everybody thought and said that Franklin was a Quaker. So that made him even more famous.
Right.
And
Little
everybody
did they
thought
know.
that. Well, exactly. And everybody thought that Franklin had written by himself the Pennsylvania Constitution.
It's interesting because early in the episode you were saying that, war is so important. It's, it's how you establish yourself, your identity. And then they're looking at these Quakers and saying they're perfect, but Quakers don't believe in war. So how do they justify that?
True. That's the complexity of everything and the multiple paradoxes you find in history. They admired the Quakers, but they thought they were eccentric.
Oh, okay.
That is, they thought they understood that a society could not be. You could not have 50 million Quakers in one country. They saw them as pacifist people who also. Of course, you have to understand, obviously, that there is a filter. Everything, because we're talking about people who had never seen a Quaker, who had never been to England or Pennsylvania.
Good point.
So they read things in French. So there is a tremendous filter, a very thick filter.
Right.
And they were admired also because to French people, they had no priests. They had no churches, no priests. Since there was a feeling of anti-clericalism, against the Catholic Church that was so dominating. And actually, it's Voltaire wrote in this vein. Voltaire, who was anti-clerical, he admired the Quakers because he thought they had no priests. Of course, this can be discussed, obviously, but that's how they were perceived. So that's one of the paradoxes.
It feels of like a very I get it. Like it's a very bourgeois notion to be like, listen, that's the way to live. Am I going to do it? Absolutely not.
But other people should.
But other folks should. Yeah. Other people. Me, no, of course not.
But that's part of this imaginary, because as I said, most people, of course, the vast majority of Europeans had never seen America. So there was always things that were quite informed, correct. Actually, in the 1780s, there were French histories of the Revolutionary War, and when you read them, you find that relatively correct, or accurate, I should say. But at the same time, there is also an imaginary dimension to it. This is the new world, after all. That's how Europeans saw America at the time. So they saw it as a land that had to be different from Europe by definition.
So almost romanticized, sort of.
Yes, and what the war changed, or the French involvement in the war changed, is that suddenly you had officers who came back from America, having seen America and having seen Americans. And what is quite entertaining in a way is to read their essays, because they all wanted to publish essays or travel accounts, on America, because that was very fashionable, and because you had those salons, in Paris. That was a very important of the elite life. Salons were usually held by a woman, a lady, noble lady, that had people over for dinner, invited philosophers, because you needed philosophers. You needed artists, and they would talk. They would discuss things, and in those salons, that's a very important part of French intellectual life in the 1770s and 1780s. Franklin, for example, was invited to those salons all the time. So those what were called Americanists. It's a very funny phrase, because that's what I am now, an Americanist. That's how I would be known in France. People who study America. But in 1780s, they were called Americanists. They came back from America, having seen it, having a first-hand experience of America, and it changed things, because they could say, yes, Americans are like this, they do this, they do that, so it became less imaginary, but it's their vision. It remained, 100% subjective.
That's really fascinating. Now, this actually thematically, I think. Oh, go ahead, Lynn. Sorry.
I was just going to say that you're talking about the salons and, thinking of revolutionary and later Philadelphia. One of our episodes was on Elizabeth Willing Powell. And of course, she didn't call them salons, but had very similar meetings, dinners and bringing people over held by a woman, talking about politics and things like that. So it's interesting that they did that, but then they tried to say, no, it's not a salon because we're not a monarchy. So they were trying to twist it into a more Republican form of these salons.
By the way, that was a way for women to get into the public sphere,
Right.
through the salon. That's one of the paradoxes of the French monarchy or the French Ancien regime, is that women, of course, were not in any parliament, and could not become ministers or whatever, of course. But that doesn't mean that they had no opinion and they were not listened to.
Right.
Because those, in French, we call them salonières, those who held the salon. And the salonière, for example, one of the most famous was Condorcet's wife. Condorcet was a mathematician and philosopher, and his wife had a salon, and that was very well known in Paris at the time.
Interesting.
So just that is, so the American is coming back over, and sharing their experience and sort of peeling back the veil of that imaginary world. Is it this sort of tying things back thematically all the way right back to the beginning? So do you think that it's worth us sort of peeling back that veil, that sort of that fantasy of what the 18th century was and what the relationship between these countries today from a historical perspective? It's is there's, I mean, obviously I know part of the answer because this is the area of your study, but I would love to transition that into a conversation about the conference that you're holding, and the value of a European perspective on the American Revolution.
Well, thank you. I'm glad I can talk about it also. But before I start, I'd like to quote a French historian who said that it's Olivier Chaline, who you interviewed for the docu-series on Washington.
Oh yeah.
Anyway, he wrote something very interesting. He said, very astute. He said the French involvement into the Revolutionary War was at the time a mistake, because it led to the monarchy, because it led to an immense, financial crisis. But to posterity, it was the best decision you could ever make, because, now we can, France, especially French politicians, but I think French people in general are very proud of having played this role. Because even if you don't know anything about history, you still know Lafayette. So about this role, and I think French people are very proud of it. Which leads me to talk about America 2026. It's the idea. There are two ideas. First, that Europeans tend to work separately, for linguistic reasons, but not just linguistic reasons, but mainly for linguistic reasons. So you have the Germans, the Italians, the Spanish. So we have our own historiography. We converse with our American peers or British, but that's it. But not among ourselves. So that was one way. One of my objectives was to have a conversation within Europe. That is, for example, in May, I'll go to Turin in Italy to discuss the American Revolution with Italian historians. I was in Munich last year to do the same with the German historians. So to us Europeans, it's something new. And then the second thing is to make our work known in the US. And I strongly believe that we can do it. It will be easier if we do it collectively. That is just, as myself or maybe with a couple of graduate students. And then third thing, I said two, but there is three. The third goal is to make better known in Europe the new developments in the historiography, in the US historiography of the American Revolution, because things have changed tremendously in the past, 20 years. And this needs to be better known in Europe. So that's the three objectives. And the idea is there's this major conference in fall 2026, but we have small conferences or workshops along the way. We were in Munich, we were in Lyon, we're going to Turin, we'll go to Leiden, we'll go back to Germany, and we'll probably go to Philadelphia. So there are milestones, I guess, on the way to the major conference. We also have an exhibit because part of our work is also geared to the public. We'll have an exhibit in La Rochelle, so in Western France, a museum exhibit with, talks, public talks. So it's also meant to I want to say, to reveal the American Revolution to most French people, so that they know that there was, because of course, in France, we are strongly influenced by our own revolution. There are people who think that's the only revolution that counts is the French Revolution. So we want to say, hey, look, there was another revolution across the seas.
Will there be anything online? So if there are any talks, will they possibly be online? It would be really cool to take all the talks and then do essays and publish that. Is that being talked about?
Yes, definitely. We have one of our partners is the University of Virginia Press, and they will
perfect.
They will publish 1 or 2 volumes out of our work. Some are, and we have a website, and there and a newsletter, a monthly newsletter, and there you can find recordings of some conferences, because some are hybrid, but not all, fortunately. But some that are recorded, we've kept the recordings, definitely.
Oh, fabulous. We'll have to put those links on. We'll put those links on our information, our website as well, so that people can go to them.
For sure. Yeah, and I can't underemphasize how much opportunity there is in studying a European perspective on American history. Just on a personal note, we flew to France to interview Bertrand among other historians with an idea of like, hey, we want to make sure we get a global perspective on this, and we went in with one idea, and this is for the Washington documentary series that is not out yet, so you will have to see what it will end up being. But we went in with one idea, and then I sat down for 3 interviews with 3 French scholars and was like, I was completely wrong. Our conception of this relationship is completely wrong. And it's not that the work and the writings don't exist. They're just not published here in the States. Like our own blindness to exactly what you said, the experience in France, that you're, hey, this is the only important revolution that happened, was yours. We have the same biases on our end, and it completely shattered my conception of the relationship between France and English. And it was a couple hours of conversation that did it. It wasn't exactly like diving into the deep, like the nooks and crannies of any historical record. It was right there for the taking of conversations with people like yourself.
But what you go back to one of your previous questions is, I do think that a global perspective or European perspective or transatlantic perspective on the American Revolution can really bring a lot to the American public, of course, but also to American scholars. Because we necessarily, if you write from another place, you necessarily write differently. I mean,
yeah.
Even if you use the same sources, you're going to write differently. And so part of our project, America 2026, it's also, if we get enough funds for that, would be to have to make available online European sources on the American Revolution, like published sources, because manuscript would be too much, but published sources. For example, books in German on the American Revolution, or books in French, in Italian. I mean, and then with an abstract in English, to either make people see that everywhere the American Revolution was written about. Let me give you one last example, is the Lyon contest essay. I found an essay in Danish, published in 1785 in Copenhagen, answering the Lyon question. So it shows that it can be anywhere. it can pop up anywhere. People thought about the American Revolution, and it led to reflections on colonization everywhere in Europe.
Yeah, that's great. So what's you said you have a website up for the conference right now? What's that website, just so that our listeners can go and take a look at it?
www.america2026.eu. EU being for Europe.
And so I encourage everyone to go check it out, subscribe to the newsletter, and keep up to date as these things keep happening, because it's incredibly fascinating. And Lynn and I will be following along over the next couple of years as well.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for your interest in what we do, and I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no,
thank you for what you do.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Bertrand, for joining us and having this conversation today. We really enjoyed it.
Thank you. I enjoyed it too very much. Very pleasant.
Thank you for listening to the full episode of Too Complicated for History. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and if you did, please leave us a review on Odyssey, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to follow us on our social media platforms at 2C4H_podcast, or check out the link in the description. This will keep you in the loop for show updates, new episodes, and exclusive content.
Too Complicated for History is a podcast from Primary Source Media. Produced by Patrick Long and Lynn Price Robbins. Edited and mixed by Curtis Fritsch. Opening theme music by Sheena Biratello.